up, things like different items around the financing mechanisms and the pools available both at the federal and state level. Things like where is the need more specifically. We've been working with the demographer's office to tease out some more of that information and digging into that. We're working right now for this subcommittee and a few others to start taking these brainstorming and ideation conversations we've been having and go into a learning mode in April. And what we're going to be doing is putting together some panel discussions, bringing in some experts that can talk to us more specifically about some of the financing nuances and tools and some of the limitations and options there, as well as hearing from some developers about more from a practical and pragmatic standpoint, how they approach this and some of the considerations they have. And then hopefully we'll be ready to take all the conversations you all have been having, those panels in April and go into May and June, starting to put all of that on the table and pull down from 10,000 feet, really get all the way down into the weeds level and start identifying some specific recommendations that we want to stress test and identifying where we may need those. So part of today's conversation, the back half, is going to be talking about those panels. We've got some ideas. Some of the members have been helping us connect with folks. Carrie has been talking with a number of folks, but we want to hear from all of you specifically, who else you would like us to bring to those panels and those discussions, and what specifically you'd like to learn coming out of those, so we can work with some of those panelists to come to that ready to offer those ideas. We will, as I talked on our last call, then be moving into a lot of stakeholder engagement, and we'll want your help getting input from a number of different folks. The other big area where we're going to spend some time on the front half of today's calls, we've had some specific requests to talk about things like the need for plain language and otherwise accessible contracts and processes. So we're going to do a little bit of brainstorming of what that looks like, what some of the challenges are that we're seeing, and what some of the solutions may be, and where you'd like us to go get some more information and bring it back. So before I do what we usually do with the intros and the reflections, does anybody have any questions or reactions to that arc of activities over the next 8 weeks that I've laid out? I don't see any yet, but that I will obviously leave that door open. So if questions or reactions or ideas, jump on offer them today on the call, or you know how to get hold of me all the time. I will now do our usual administrative items up front. One, and it's happening right now, but we do ask that those members of the subcommittee, if you're in a place that it's safe and comfortable to do so, that you're on camera so that your colleagues can see you and interact with you. We do ask if there's members of the public that you keep your camera off until the public comment period. And if there are members of the public who would like to address this subcommittee on housing, we welcome you doing so during the public comment period towards the end. And I would just ask that you drop either myself or Carrie Steele a message in the chat, and you'll hear me repeat this a couple times throughout today. But with that, I'm going to do as I frequently do, since we spent 4 weeks not talking to each other. And I would love to just kind of reground us in anything that were big takeaways for you on that last conversation we were having about things around financing and about the market and development itself, and or things that are on your mind as we come into today's conversation. And Brian, having been one of the first ones on the call, you end up top left on my screen, which means I'll go to Brian and then I'll go to Paul.
Honestly, the thought that's in my mind, and I think it really plays into today's conversation, not so much a reflection on our past conversation, as we've been talking with a developer and policy advocate out of California who's doing some accessibility, like their mission is accessible housing. And so we've been talking, had a great coffee with someone from their organization today, and that conversation was on my mind as entered today, just what they're doing, and that combination of kind of the policy side of things as well as being a developer themselves is really intriguing to me as representing organizations who do both of those things as well.
Any big takeaways you want to share about what they're doing, or things that you think could be points that we may want to explore? And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if there's things on your mind that
Yeah,
we'll highlight for the group.
sure. So one of the pieces of their work has been the development of some inclusive design standards that they're working with design professionals on, um, and trying to implement not only in uh, their project. They're developing a project out in California, working to develop partners here in Colorado, to expand their work. Um, but those inclusive design standards are not only relevant to what they are building, but what others are building, and trying to teach others. And I get a bit of this from my wife's work. She works at an architecture firm and they do a lot of trauma-informed design. And this is sort of a similar kind of concept, is inclusive design through the design process, and really trying to realize the outcomes that they're hoping for kind of through that construction process. So it's just that's kind of something that stuck out to me. And we're talking about um, trainings or conference sessions in our own organization around this idea. So
No, I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
mhm.
I'm going to go to Paul and then to Rochelle.
Um, the the Google form we filled out,
Yes.
um, I guess the thought I've had is it's one of those things that maybe if you look at it at different points in this process, I might be able to add more to it. And I was just maybe going to use this as a plea to maybe make it a living document or have a chance to revisit it in the future.
As it happens, Carrie is next on my screen. Carrie, do I take it that we can make that happen?
I think we can probably make that happen. Let me go in and make it a little bit more accessible looking. It's a little wonky looking right now, but I can do that for you guys, and I will share it all out in an email after the call.
Yeah, I
You know
don't
how you love it when I
necessarily have
put her on
anything.
the spot.
Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. Rochelle and then Cassidy, curious, anything that you took away from our last conversation, which some thought got a little wonky going into the financing? I know it was there, as well as talking about the demand, or things on your mind as we come into today's conversation.
Sure, thank you for that. Rochelle Mitchell, Connections for Independent Living, the Association for Colorado Centers for Independent Living as well. I have had, since we met last, had the opportunity to be at Disability Rights Advocacy Day at the Capitol and also participate in a press conference with Denver Metro Fair Housing right after that. And a couple of the things that have come up is the working on a bill that doesn't discriminate for people that have made modifications to their rental units, and also working on the last year of research with Denver Metro Fair Housing has me going back to the place of yes, design and inclusivity, design and access to that housing is physically super important, but we are kind of behind the eight ball on the information side of the bias and straight up discrimination that people with disabilities are facing continuously. And that was what the point of that year-long research project with Denver Metro Fair Housing was, is that just the ability to rent from somebody with a disability, it's goes way beyond whether or not there's grab bars or ramps. And it's just the mere fact that they have a disability and they're being discriminated against. So the information side of things and the education side of accessible housing, I think, is at the forefront of my thought process right now.
I appreciate you naming that, and I'm going to make sure that we kind of weave that in to our conversation. On the agenda item, we left it pretty broad. There is the plain language, there's the contracts, but we really want to talk about that broad topic of accessibility. And I will tell you, yesterday we were on another subcommittee, and their big conversation happened to be the outdoor recreation. And they were talking about misinformation and stigmas, and the amount of public education and awareness that needs to take place. And we started brainstorming with them some very specific tools of how we can better educate people and address some of those stigmas. So maybe that's a conversation we can look at having as well, from what I'm hearing from you. Cassidy, let me go to you and then to Karen.
Yeah, I would echo that, Rochelle, and I appreciate you bringing that up because that's pretty close to the work that I do as well, and what I'm focusing on a lot in my job. I guess reflections from last time, I personally don't have experience in the affordable housing space, so I was just interested in learning about the process and a lot of the behind the scenes of how things are getting financed and whatnot. So yeah, I'm looking forward to learning again in this meeting and having another good conversation.
Great. And I will assure you, we are working to bring in some of those financing experts from places like Jaffa here in the state. We're seeing if any of the feds are willing to talk. They've been a little camera and voice shy. And we're also looking at if we can get the developer perspective. So we're going to do some deep dives through the panels on that financing side. Let me go to Karen and then Shelley.
Hi, everyone. Karen Kallenberg with Habitat for Humanity of Colorado. I actually was not with y'all last month. It was our legislative week, so I was at the Capitol. So not a lot of reflection on, the work, still catching up a little bit there. I just will say overall, this session I think has been a bit overwhelming with all of the housing legislation that is out there, and just again, being on this committee, having a different lens in terms of when I'm looking at housing legislation and how it is or is not addressing certain needs, or even in some of the assessment tools and legislation that way, like is what's currently happening at the Capitol going to help move the needle in terms of housing for individuals with disabilities? But nice to be back with you. And again, I apologize that I was not here last week. It sounds like you had a good discussion.
I appreciate that, Karen. I think we did. We're glad you're with us. I will just, on one of the things you mentioned about all of the activity, one of the people or the voices and perspectives we're working to make sure we bring to next month's conversation is from the governor's office and from the executive branch, kind of driving a lot of the housing work. We want to make sure we don't politicize this by bringing in any one particular legislator who's working on things, but we think it's important that we're aware and that as we develop recommendations, we look at opportunities to leverage and draw on what may be happening on the broader housing and affordable housing front, instead of looking at these as two totally separate topics. So I know it's been a ton going on this session in particular, and we'll work to bring some of the information of what's coming out of this session and out of the executive branch to this group's discussions. Shelley, what came out of, what was on your mind coming out of the financing discussion, or coming into today, or just what's been on your mind when it comes to this broad topic since the whole group was last together?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you. Shelley Marquez, President of Mercy Housing, Mountain Plains. So for me, I think what I come out of the discussion and the conversation from the last session is, Mercy Housing is a developer, we're an owner operator. And when I think about the conversations and adding additional requirements, and affordable housing development is challenging as it is with all the multiple layers, that we don't want to get to a point where it becomes even or much more complex for developers. I think Barrick and I had a chance to kind of, there are minimum requirements that are in place today that we know all developers have to meet based on zoning, a code. And so, I think that's probably our baseline. But then, understanding what's in the marketplace as far as availability. And I don't share that to say we don't need to focus on this work, because we do, and it's important. But I think what we have talked about as a committee is what's out there today, and, understanding what is the baseline and then the need, and how do we ensure whatever recommendations are made, that it moves us closer to meeting the needs of Colorado residents. And so That's kind of what's on my mind of, how do we get the right data to really inform our decisions, to be able to make recommendations to move us in a positive way.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Shelley. And on that, note or a broader note on that, I do want to just speak for a minute. I mentioned the process that we're going to go through another learning round in April and into May with some panels and some presentations. And then the summer is really going to be us starting to take the ideas. And I know it may seem like we've had a lot of brainstorming. Do we have tangible ideas? Carrie started going through the 100+ page of notes that she's captured just from this subcommittee and circling, where there are dozens and dozens of very actionable ideas that have come out in the process of these conversations. One of the things I'm going to be doing, our ultimate goal will be to put forward recommendations that have the greatest amount of consensus among this group. I'm not going to sit here and promise we're going to have them all be unanimous. That will be my goal, but the push is going to be as aspirational, as bold as possible with the greatest amount of consensus. And I think the way we're going to get there is by everybody feeling very comfortable to, as I say frequently, disagree without being disagreeable, challenge your own thinking and put the ideas on the table that challenge all of us to really set that bar high for what we can do. But I think we also do need to keep challenging ourselves to acknowledge what will be some of the challenges to advancing the most bold ideas we can. So that's what we're going to keep doing, is trying to find consensus, but stay very aspirational. With that, I want to pivot us into the first substantive conversation for today's session, and that's about accessibility of the contracts and the language and the process. And we've heard the need for, as people will say, plain language for contracts. What I want to do is start by having people identify one area that you see in its current format as a challenge in accessibility for a diversity of folks with disabilities. So depending on that full range. And then as one person identifies one of those, rather than just moving on to the next one and recording that, I'd like to have some group discussions about what may be better ways to do it. And I really do want to put all of it on the table, from the language that's in a contract to how people learn about the real estate markets, whether that's rental or ownership, and different types of programs that may be available, and what may be some of the barriers to people feeling fully fluent and comfortable accessing those. This time I'm going to switch it up. So Brian, I don't always call on you first. Rochelle, you're on the opposite side of my screen, which means I'm going to bring you in first. I try to give people a minute of heads up. I'm going to go to Rochelle and then to Shelley to start the conversation, not for an idea. But Rochelle, I'm curious, when you think about Coloradans with disabilities and all different forms of abilities, what are some of the challenges to, whether it's contracts or awareness and knowledge of the housing markets?
Well, we know from just basic running of a American Sign Language interpreting program for the last 35 years that just basic language access is a major problem, but that has to do with almost every aspect of life. Specifically, it's incredibly daunting for anybody who uses anything other than the type of English communication that we're using at this moment. So anything that needs to be in plain English or large print or Braille or American Sign Language, just the lack of, and it goes back to knowledge about whose responsibility it is to provide equal access to language. And just I serve on the Denver Sidewalk Committee as well. I think I mentioned it's extremely exciting. But Ordinance 307 is very exciting. Just giving that survey to Denver residents and with a statement that said, if you require some other form of communication to be able to, access this, just that basic language, not even the actual actionable item of giving them that language offering. Just the mere statement that it's available to you if you need it is such a huge step in that direction, and we struggle continuously to do that. So that tiny little step of access.
So here's what I want to open it up to for the group. This seems like a very straightforward, whether we're talking about American Sign Language or Braille or others, but the access to the language. When we put forward recommendations, we have a lot of arrows in our quiver, so to speak. They range from new laws, are kind of the heavy hammer that you can recommend be swung. They may be new forms of rules or regulation that get into compliance and oversight. They may be processes that you recommend state agencies, whether that's the Department of Housing or others, undertake. You may make recommendations that are less legalistic and more best practices, that you recommend that whether it's a local government or a local housing authority, or you recommend that a developer or realtors or leasing firms take different efforts. So I want to ask everybody to think with all of those different options, what are some possibilities? And today isn't to judge or vote on them, it's to brainstorm and put them on the table. But when we think about what Rochelle just named, what might be some things that we want to discuss that run that gamut from best practices we recommend to the public or private sector up to things we ask the government to do. And I'm going to start with Shelley and then go to Karen.
Okay, great. Shelley Marquez. So I would say, I think what, as a operator of affordable housing, there are fair housing requirements that we are required to abide by. So if a resident asks for reasonable accommodations, we're going to make accommodations to meet their needs, but just basic requirements. All of our developments are built with accessibility or hand grab bars, handrails, things like that. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there are some requirements that are already in place. And then if a resident, in your question, I want to make sure I stick with that. What are some of the challenges of contracts in the market?
Actually, Shelley, what I want to do right now is I'm going to come back to that. Okay. I want to stay on the challenge that Rochelle raised of the language, and whether that's people who require sign language or others. How might we improve what is done in industry or in the housing market to make it language more accessible?
Yeah, so we have a lot of translation services that are available to residents or individuals that come to the property if they don't speak English, or if they have they need help with interpretation, or if they're vision impaired. There are resources that we can bring to bear to help them navigate what a contract would look like, or what rental agreements might be in place. And so there are resources available that you really to serve someone that has a disability of whatever that may look like. So I would just say from that perspective, that is something that we do try to accommodate with third-party partners, because not all of our staff, if staff doesn't, if we don't have that available within the staff, then what other resources? So understanding what that is and where you have gaps, being able to make the connections or having resources to fill those gaps are really important.
And Shelley, before I move on, I want to make sure that I'm clear. Am I correct in understanding that's something that Mercy Housing decided to do because you saw it as a best practice? It wasn't something that any state or federal agency directed you to do?
That's correct. I mean, you have to think about who you're serving and how do you bring about resources to be able to serve individuals. And so we do have, that is an approach that Mercy Housing, but I would say other housing providers on the affordable housing spectrum, they provide that as well. So I don't think it's unique and different. I see Karen shaking her head, unique and different to Mercy. But when you think about who we're serving, we need to be mindful of that. And I think it's just a step that the affordable housing community is taking to look at what are those resources and how do we bring them to bear to make sure that we're overcoming some of the barriers that may exist today.
Gotcha. I appreciate that. And I wasn't trying to put on the spot or call Mercy out. I just want to make sure that we're capturing this correctly, both for the group that's on here and because we're being streamed on YouTube and other folks may be watching this video after the fact, that may be an industry adopted best practice that we can discuss featuring and recommending. Karen, let me just, since you got called out and you are next to her on my screen anyway, let me go to you and to the point of ensuring that the language, the contracts are straightforward to access, whether that's somebody needing sign language or needing interpretation, translation services. What ideas do you have that range from regulatory and law to best practices that should be highlighted or encouraged?
So Karen with Habitat for Humanity, I'm not sure that you could actually put the word contract and straightforward in a sentence. And I mean, try to find something more complicated than your mortgage documents, your promissory notes, your deed of trust. And then you add in other deeds and affordability requirements. I mean, I think just in general, the process of being, and I think everybody knows now, like home ownership is my space. And so like the process to buy a house it's very complicated. Similar to what Shelley said, I mean, there are fair housing that we follow and best practices. I do believe, and I don't have it in front of me, but I can look for next time, when we do access money from the state, there are certain requirements that they have for us in terms of making sure that if we do have somebody who's hearing impaired, how are we going to communicate with them? If they're going to be, they use the word beneficiary in terms of the grant funding. So I think that's in place. And I know we try in general to do a lot of training with our home buyers about the contracts and the documentation, and try to from the very beginning, try to explain, what they're getting themselves into in terms of a purchase agreement. And so I think that training and explanation does help, but I think contracting in general is just, I think, a challenge. And then you add, yes, the language barrier or, hearing impaired or something like that on top of it. I don't know if I have a magic wand other than to just say for the third time it's complicated.
Understood. And I think you put it so well that contracts themselves, let alone something like a mortgage contract, are complex for anybody. And then you add additional compounding factors. Cassidy, let me bring you in. When you think about somebody with any type of different disability, whether that's visual, hearing, somebody that requires sign language, somebody with some cognitive development disabilities, what are some of the things that you think we should be considering as either requirements or best practices?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly thinking about the effective communication piece here that's going to be required, especially for those providers that are receiving the federal funding, but also as accommodations for private housing providers as well. So the law is already requiring effective communication, but I do think that, like, as Rochelle pointed out, like there are certainly gaps there, right? Like people don't know whose responsibility is it to provide this accommodation. It certainly like couldn't be me as a housing provider. I'm not going to do it. So I think, like, I don't know, like my mind always goes to like I mean, more like trainings, like offered for maybe those smaller housing providers, smaller landlords, who may not have the resources to have, counsel at their disposal to talk with them about what's a reasonable accommodation, what's a reasonable modification. And so I think something like specifically with effective communication, even before someone becomes like your tenant or something like that, and just kind of detailing that nuance, I think that would be helpful. I'm also thinking of like kind of something that like Rochelle mentioned with on the flyer, the sidewalk flyer is like making sure like accommodation requests, like the process for that is available on like these housing providers' websites, right? So like if you need any accommodations to access our applications or anything like that, here's how you could do it, and making that really available on websites. That's, I feel like, how people are accessing most of the housing stuff these days is like through Zillow or someone's property management page or something like that. If we are encouraging folks, like put the disclaimers, or not the disclaimers, but the notices, right there on the front page, I think that would be a really good best practice.
Thanks, Cassidy. Let me go to Brian and then to Paul. Brian, your thoughts on how we could make this process, and particularly looking at it through this language lens, more accessible?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with Karen, that it's complicated. It's, me understanding my own mortgage documents or my own lease agreements, beyond just a cursory glance. Um, I know from my own experience that that's been a difficulty, and I can't imagine sort of adding on a layer of inaccessibility. So, in thinking about, jumping ahead into, what solutions there might be, and maybe that's not the right place to go right now, but, I think there's always opportunities in process development and rulemaking and things like that to ensure that there is, um, at the very least, a modicum of uh, accessibility requirements, beyond, language justice. We often forget, that language justice includes, opportunities for those who, um, have disabilities to access information as well. A lot of times it gets, you know, pigeonholed, the idea of language justice gets pigeonholed into, straight translation services, and it can sometimes look like, um, providing, say, Spanish language translation, which is great, but I think we neglect, to think about, language justice in terms of, those with, uh, sight impairments or hearing impairments, and what that means for them, when it comes to these complicated transactions. So I don't know if I'm quite getting at your question well enough, but I think that there's opportunity, and especially in this realm of language, to, know better and do better kind of thing.
And you've already given me some thoughts on a follow-up question that I'll get to for the whole group in just a second. Paul, let me go to you.
Broadly, this question's outside my comfort zone.
Yep.
So I'm kind of thinking in it more as, from the aspect of the contracts I sign every day, in my business. When we can rely on a standard form agreement versus something that's unique, that gives me comfort. I know it's not as unique and maybe tilted one way. It's been vetted a little bit more. And if there's deviations from that, those be identified for all parties involved. there may even be a standard rental agreement or something. I don't know. The complexity of a contract, I don't know if you can avoid it. I loved your comment, Karen. We just did our health insurance renewal, and it was an online thing. And there was this web app that popped up, and you had to try to answer questions. And what it did is it tried to bypass all the complicated and do it for you. And I didn't like it because I felt disconnected from the contract language. And so if there's tools that can simplify or add assurances to the process, I think they should be parallel and not in lieu of. I feel like when I did my mortgage, there was this thing saying it was like a checklist and had 6 boxes or something. It said, you have the right to this and this and this, and have you seen this form? And maybe if there's something like that that was at the table at the time of contract, that might help and just force accountability on that transaction. As far as sign language and all those means of access, it might be a spot where there might need a state resource or something can be provided where, I'm thinking if we hire somebody and maybe they have, a disability that they're working with, our onboarding process, the people they go through, those are always changing in and out. So even if there's training or something, we're not going to be able to offer that support as a business in a consistent manner. But if we knew that there was a state hotline that we could just dial up, and that gives that new employee or that new renter or whatever assistance, that would give it more consistency.
Got it. Thank you. I'm going to ask a question, and Shelley, I'm going to go to you first because I think you may be able to help us understand how it exists right now. And as I pose this, I want to be very clear. This is not me proposing this, and I'm not asking anybody to vote one way or another. But Brian, I'm kind of picking up on your comment, and I'm curious people's thoughts. In addition to, or in parallel with, what are some of the reasonable accommodation requirements that exist in the Americans with Disabilities Act, in Colorado's Anti-Discrimination Act? Is there something that we should be exploring? Should it be incumbent in the name of civil rights and in the name of justice, as the phrase Brian used, for additional steps to either be required or expected to ensure full access? Are we covered by what's in the reasonable accommodations protections that exist right now? And Shelley, the reason I'm asking you first is because you're already operating within that realm of making those accommodations. But I want to honor the questions that have been raised around the civil rights and justice side of this. Should this group be contemplating further measures in the name of that, or are there protections? And what we're need to address more is how they're implemented.
So Shelley Marquez, Derek, I would say, for any new developer, you have a requirement to meet code of how many units are accessible, right? And then there are always, if you have residents that have accommodation needs, to make the necessary conversions to the properties. So I think what we find often is that there's more need or there's more demand than there is available units that are developed for accessible, so you can make changes. But I want to say, and I don't want to so are they fully accessible, or is it adding the grab bar? So does it meet the full requirement? So, are there things, again, that puts another layer of requirements for developers? And we kind of had a conversation, like, even we meet work or accommodation needs that are requested of us at any point in time. There is a cost to developers to do that, but that is something that if we get a request from a resident, we're going to take all the steps and measures to meet those accommodations. But it still may not be the unit that someone needs to be able, that's handicap accessible, because the way that everything is set up. So I don't know if I'm getting to your
You are,
question.
but you answered a piece of it. I want to dig on another side of it. The accommodations outside of the physical unit, when it comes to the accommodation to help somebody interpret, understand the contract, understand the process of purchasing or leasing a unit. How are we doing there?
Well, my belief, there are a lot of regulatory requirements, and as a fair housing lender, as a, fair housing, most of it, if your funding's coming from federal funding, state, local funding, you have a lot of requirements to already meet. And so what would be interesting, and Rochelle, you talk a little bit about Denver Metro Fair Housing, when they do their study and research, I'm curious to know, is some of that coming from providers that are affordable housing providers, or is it, are there other requirements that could be imposed to, because you've got for-profit, nonprofit developers, and so are we meeting requirements today? Absolutely. Are we looking at how do you serve this community? You have to, and language is one of them, but accessibility, and that's something, we're in the process of adding a playground, and part of the conversation is it accessible to the residents, to someone that has a disability? So being mindful of those questions, and it's not just accessing the property, but all of the amenities associated with it.
Thank you. And Rochelle, since you got name checked a little bit there, I'm going to go to you, and I really want to stay in this narrow piece about the administrative and legal and knowledge process of, are we doing sufficient under what's required by the ADA to provide access and accommodations? Are there civil rights or justice considerations that Colorado should be having a discussion about even greater efforts, either as best practices or requirements, to ensure that someone with any type of disability can engage in the process, and less about the unit itself?
Yeah, thank you. Rochelle Mitchell again. And to Shelley's point, I appreciate to the point specifically about Denver Metro Fair Housing. Yes, there were multiple affordable housing agents that were brought into that conversation over the course of the year. And they just released their report. And if I can grab it and put it in the chat or give it to Barrick, the link that they released last Friday, I will do that. And it gives a full description of all of the places that they traveled throughout the state. They worked with Disability Law Colorado. They worked with ACCIL and the Centers for Independent Living and ARC of Colorado and Cross Disability Coalition to make sure that they were, kind of casting a very wide net there. Very simply, no, we're not doing that. We know the basic medical access to language isn't there, so it's not there in housing. People are arriving at the emergency room and are unable to get ASL interpreters provided to them for emergency medical needs. And so when it comes to their access to housing, we just know that that's not happening on a regular basis. Either it's already inaccessible because the language for the information has already been provided in some other way that wasn't accessible. Yes, the ADA states that it should be provided, and yes, there are best practices around it. There's plenty of ASL best practices. We have an entire deaf commission for the state of Colorado that advises on this, but it's not done, and it's not done on a regular basis. So whether it's and it's not done sometimes at our own agencies because of lack of resources or whatever the case may be. But there being some very plain language just like for example, for my survey that we talked about with the Denver Sidewalk Committee, we just added the language at the beginning of the survey. The language was just a disclaimer that said, it's available to you. We want you to know it's here. That step forward and that change up of who should be responsible for providing it kind of changes the game a little bit in making sure that it's just a disclaimer at the very beginning. And I don't want to get into the hair dryer situation where I got to try and dry my hair with a giant tag on it because somebody used it in a bathtub. I'm just saying some very simplistic language that says that we can provide this to you in multiple languages, and then an information campaign that says you should provide this in multiple languages because it will make everything better. It will give you better, a better broad swath of clientele. It'll give you, more inclusive access to all of your materials, maybe for sometimes even your own staff members. These are all the things that we should just be doing in best practices.
Shelley, jump back in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things. So at our properties, one of the things that they do is they do have, it's a translation card at the desk. So if a resident comes in the example I would use, we have a property called Grace Apartments that serves a lot of refugee communities. There are individuals that speak, there's over 14 languages spoken at this property. And so when they're working with our property management team or working on lease ups or the application process, they can scan this card. Someone, if they can't communicate in English, they scan the card. So Rochelle, to your point, and then that card, it helps them find the language that they could read. And so where we have identified it, but what I've heard from our property management team, because I said, well, what about visually impaired individuals? What do we do in those cases? And they're saying, a lot of times they're coming in already with a case manager that's helping them navigate through the process, or a case manager that's working closely with them. So that happens, but it also brings the question, what if you don't have a case manager or someone to provide that extra level of support? How do we ensure that they're being guided appropriately and have the right tools and resources needed? So I just wanted to share that. But the translation service that we provide, it's through Akorbi, Akorbi.
Thank you. Cassidy, jump in.
Yeah, another thing kind of that I just wanted to mention here is I know of like the Commission for the Deaf, Hard of Hearing, and Deafblind. They have the Rural Auxiliary Services Program, which allows basically anyone to get free ASL interpretations, or CART, which is essentially like live transcription. And so you just need to be in a rural jurisdiction in order to access that. But I know like sign language interpreters are expensive, and so a lot of people like bulk at like wanting to provide that. So if people were more aware of like this program, or if we created more programs like it to kind of subsidize some of that cost, I think that would be really beneficial and would help people who need these accommodations actually get them.
Thanks, Cassidy. Rochelle.
I just wanted to follow up really quick. Rural Auxiliary Services has been out of money since the beginning of the year. They did have a $500,000 emergency amount that was granted by the, I think it was granted. It's supposed to go to the JBC. I think it was last week, but we are really working to figure out better ways to appropriate those funds, or actually to direct those funds. We do know that it's only served a really small percentage of people in the state of Colorado. It's a great idea and resource program. It just hasn't functioned correctly in the past few years. So, but you're right. People don't want to pay for, not even hospitals want to pay for ASL services. So it's a problem.
I'm going to kind of combine some of these conversations and points being raised and ask a combined or a two-part question. Maybe it's two different questions. Brian, I'll give you a heads up. I'm going to go to you first on this. I'm hearing things about the accessibility or being able to get these supports, whether it's ASL or otherwise. We're also hearing a lot of conversation around plain language. And so I'll invite everybody to weigh in on one or both of these questions. One is, are there ways that we want as a subcommittee to consider recommendations for ways that would improve access to things like ASL? And I don't want that to be the only one. It's just a clear example that's been raised. And whether that's state requiring something, state providing something, state working in a public-private partnership, is there something that we want to consider recommending? And when I say this, I mean put on the table for our summer discussions of what's all on the table to make that more available. And the other question that kind of piggybacks on this plain language issue. I think we all would agree we would love plain language contracts. I think we've talked about it as mortgages. I think we can all agree that many contracts are complex. We're not here to tackle all contracts and contract law in the state of Colorado. But should there be a different standard that we want to consider in plain language for Coloradans with disabilities as a civil rights issue? So Brian, I'll let you weigh in on the accessibility of these support services and or the question of plain language as a civil right.
Yeah, those are two big questions. Yeah, the plain language piece as a civil right is interesting to contemplate. Like, you know, on the surface, like it seems like a good place to go, right? Like, you know, can we get some of these complex documents, and you know, and not just mortgages and lease agreements, but you know, even you know something like companion animal agreement, you know, something like that, you know, does it always have to be in the legalese? And that's a question I just don't know the answer to. Is, you know, a lot of contracts are boilerplate and they're sort of there's kind of a lowest common denominator in there. And that lowest common denominator does not include being plain language. It would seem to me. So I don't know. I'm struggling to find an answer to your question, Barrick. I guess
Totally fair.
I just don't know.
Yeah, and to be clear, that this isn't me proposing or recommending it. It's me kind of
Yeah.
pulling the threads of different things I'm hearing. Does anybody else want to jump in on either of those two questions? Of one, are there recommendations that we should put on the table for discussion or learn about options to increase access to support services like guidance navigators, ASL interpreters? Or this second question of, is plain language something that should be considered differently for Coloradans with disabilities when it comes particularly to housing, as we're here to talk about?
I'll probably get skewered for this. I don't know the rules, but measures of access for sign language and different physical modifications. To me, I've been trying to find the language of ADA and some of that stuff, but that seems to really, at least how I assume it, to align pretty clearly with that. I'd love to get more guidance or understand it better, but it seems like policy or the legislative rulings on the topic of different languages is kind of vague. And to automatically assume we have to provide access in multiple languages, like I said, I would love guidance, but as a business owner, I struggle getting communication out to my 40 employees in English and having them all understand it, and to have to feel like that's a responsibility of mine to do. And I don't know how many languages. That uncertainty scares me.
Understood, Paul. And I want to clarify for the whole group in case I wasn't clear. The offering of these services in different written or spoken languages, I believe is a valid conversation for somebody to have. It does not fall under the charges that we have, which is specifically about accessing housing for Coloradans with disabilities. And I have not seen anywhere anybody suggest that somebody not speaking English and speaking instead another spoken and written language is that disability. So I think we can narrow our conversation down to whether it's the blind requiring different supports, deaf requiring different supports, or somebody with a cognitive disability. Should there be accommodations more clearly expected, required, or as best practices? And I know I'm not throwing the easy questions out to this group, and that's my intent is to kind of spark the thinking and help you name for us where we need to bring you more information to be able to have some of these conversations. Shelley, I see you coming off mute.
Shelley Marquez. So I guess what comes to mind is, I think about the last time I visit the bank, there's accommodations there, right? And the banking industries have pretty much standardized. So, I do think there's an opportunity to create best practices of what, what housing providers should make accessible for residents and, towards housing. Again, not trying to create additional layers of complexity, but if you go in, and we've talked about this, that if you're trying to execute a lease agreement and you can't read the language, or you're not really sure what you're signing, that's problematic. So there should be some best practices. Oh, you're on mute.
I think this is this interesting line that we're going to have to figure out to navigate. I think contracts are a challenge for many people to understand. We're not charged with solving the complexity of a credit card agreement or a mortgage agreement for me, for everyone. We're looking at what do we need to do and what is a best practice and what should be a legal requirement, or what should be done when it relates to the specific challenge that may exist for a Coloradan with a disability of some type. Yeah, Paul, jump in.
Yeah, so Paul, I was thinking through the lens of the taxes, the federal taxes or the state taxes that we file every year. Complicated thing, and what do you do if you need help? And knowing that there's a phone number to call or a website to go to, and when you go to that, there's other access provisions, Touchstone, etc. I was just using that as maybe a good template to start from.
I think that is an interesting one. And Carrie, before today's conversation, had flagged to me, if you haven't seen it, and we'll send this around with no endorsement, but just an FYI, the website plainlanguage.gov, which started as a number of folks from different federal agencies about the importance of plain language and what it is and what it isn't. Because some folks jump to plain language is about dumbing it down or making it less specific, and it's certainly not intended to be that, but that's one thing. I'm going to, Rochelle, I totally understand. We appreciate you being with us. We'll continue this, and I'm happy to catch up with you. Um, I'm going to pivot us, and some of this may come from the conversation we've just had. I also want to hearken us back to the conversations we've had about things like financing, some of the comments that Shelley has shared about what it looks like for a developer and making things accessible units, making them adaptable units. As I said at the top of the call, we're working to put together a couple of panels. We know right now the folks that we want to bring include people who are experts on the financing side, because that's a piece that gets pretty wonky and that we are legislatively required to address. We know we want to bring in some developers, public, private, nonprofit, of all sorts, to talk about what the process looks like and what they currently do and what considerations may be. What I want to put to this group is, what other panelists would you like to hear from? And you can give me the name of John Smith at XYZ firm, or you can just say, Derek, we really need somebody who can speak intelligently to what it would take to provide ASL interpreters or to provide plain language versions of all of our contracts. So, two-part question. Who would you like to see on these panels? And we can do one or more panels covering different topics. And what would you like to learn, or do you think your peers on this subcommittee would benefit from learning? What should be the outcome and the questions that we're asking? And I will start by leaving it open to the floor. If there's silence, I think you know me, and I will start calling on people.
I'll start. I was just, when we were talking about different services and how we can meet these needs, I was being a bad committee member and Googling around to try to figure out what was out there. But I don't know, even somebody, from the Colorado Department of Human Services that works in disability services, I was looking at their website about different interpreters. I think for those of us that are housing developers, I think our intent is always good and we want to follow the best practice or the requirement, but then it's for us having those resources or having the financial resources. So even maybe understanding, what is available, that then could help us. We weren't sure how to answer your last question in terms of what needs to be provided. So that baseline for those of us that don't work in that space every day, that might be helpful, or maybe somebody on, this group that does could share that. I think a lot of words are thrown out in terms of housing development, whether it's visitable home, accessible home, like, again, having someone define those and what that actually looks like. Does that mean, how many bedrooms does that mean need to be on the first floor, if any? And just, I think thinking through some of those different layers, and having somebody to speak to that would be interesting as well.
Thank you, Karen. And while I ask who else wants to come in, we're at 6:05, and a reminder to any members of the public, if you would like to speak to this group, we reserve time at the end of the call. Tim, I've got your name on a list. If there are others who would like to speak and address this subcommittee, drop either myself, Eric Abramson, or Carrie Steele a direct message. But what other subcommittee members want to weigh in with thoughts on specific people, roles of people, or people with types of knowledge, and the questions you would like to ask of them, or have us ask them to come prepared to address? Brian, I think I see you coming off mute, so I'm going to call you in.
Sure. And I'll just mention by name the group I talked to at the top of the call. That's called the Kelsey. They're out of the Bay Area in California, and they are, as I mentioned, both a developer of housing that's accessible, as well as kind of in the policy sphere. So they work mostly at the federal level, but I think some of that policy knowledge could trickle down. They're recently engaged with us in some things. So just again, interesting conversation, interesting work that they're doing, and kind of at that nexus of policy and development.
Thanks, Brian. Cassidy, jump in, please.
Yeah, I'm interested in like hearing more. Like I think Shelley mentioned a while back, like in her units or in her developments, there's not enough accessible units to meet the demand. And so I want to know like I guess more about like then what modifications you're having to make to the other apartments to meet like people's accessibility needs. And I think like hearing from like a developer to speak to that, or someone who, you know, owns these affordable housing or like low-income housing developments to kind of speak to that piece of things, to kind of see like what are the most common like modifications that people are requesting and how can we incorporate these into more units and develop potentially new standards that then create more units that people actually need, right? And like what we have is actually meeting the demand out there. So I kind of want to learn more about like what is actually occurring.
I think we can definitely bring some people to the panel that can help address that. Shelley, if you want to address any pieces of that, I'll give you the floor as well.
Sure, Shelley Marquez. So I would just add, I think as we do that understanding of what is needed, we also have to factor in what is the cost. You know, so you have requirements of, code of what you're going to develop. And then when you do those modifications, what is that added cost? So I would just add that as part of the additional information being shared with the group, because I think that would be helpful and can help inform, you know, if we're putting these requirements, there's also a cost. How do you pay for it? So that will be important. But I would like, I think that Eric, we've kind of talked about this, and maybe having someone from like Atlantis group or Atlantis community come in and share, similar to what Cassidy is saying. What are the needs they're seeing today when they serve, predominantly the disability community? We are talking about, I'm just curious to see what are, that could mean a lot of things. And so what is the highest demand and how are they meeting that? And so I think just being able to hear from the community, from developers that are serving the predominantly disability community would be really helpful to gain their insights on what the current needs are and what they anticipate future needs being.
Thanks, Shelley. And that's probably a good time for me to, and I will apologize if this is, getting old because I do this at every meeting, but I'm going to read our specific purpose and the deliverable that we must produce to kind of ground us in who else do we need to hear from and what else do we need to learn. And Shelley hit on pieces of it because we've had all these conversations about the need, and we can look at census and demographic information. The other piece of that is hearing directly from the developers about what they're experiencing. But per House Bill 1296, the purpose of this subcommittee is to identify barriers to securing and enjoying secure and affordable, accessible, and attainable housing for persons with disabilities, and recommendations for addressing those, specifically to the deliverables and the recommendations we need to make. We must submit a report with the findings and recommendations outlining the current need for an inventory of accessible housing in Colorado, the projected increased need for accessible housing in the next decade, and recommendations to meet future housing demand, including financing for low-income housing development. So with that and all of our conversations, and I don't suggest we're not addressing it, I just wanted to ground that again. Are there other experts that you would like to hear from we're already doing a lot of the research that you've asked us to do, working with the demographer's office, census data to bring back data. In terms of panelists, to not just send us information, but for you to engage in a conversation with, are there additional folks that you'd like to have us connect with? Paul, jump in.
So Paul Brady, I guess the first time I heard the question, I thought it was specific to language access, but this sounds like it's just broadly across the whole charge of the committee, correct?
So you're breaking up on my side just a little bit there, Paul.
This is, and who do we want to hear based on a broad perspective across the whole charge of the committee, not just specific
That's
to
right.
language access?
Correct, yes.
I think big groups that have lots of units under management, whether it's like a Morningstar that does senior living environments, I think that's a big component of this population, or even like a equity residential, Avalon Bay Communities, Graystar, you know, they manage tens of thousands of units, and I got to think they'd have some really interesting insight.
Great, we'll put that on the list to consider. Anybody else have people or just, hey, somebody who could speak with expertise or firsthand knowledge to X, Y, or Z?
Derek, I think, we're connecting you to the folks at CHAFA, because I do think that would be extremely helpful. We'll make the connection to Pat Coyle, who brings Division of Housing, DOLA experience, but also is the CEO of Atlantis Community. And then Mercy Housing is willing to, the developer can share their perspective.
Great, thank you. I know in the past I've made what I will now categorize as some soft asks of folks of, hey, if you think of something, shoot me an email. I'm going to be a little more direct and hard line in this. It's Wednesday afternoon. I'm going to ask everybody if you would carve out 10-15 minutes between now and close of business Friday and give some real thought to across these topics that we've talked about. The different types of accessibility and different types of disability. What does that look like for housing? The different types of financing, the access considerations, and really give some thought to who are the folks that either you would like to learn from, or something about that you think your peers here on the subcommittee could benefit from, or even just say, I have no idea who it is, Barrick, but if we could ask somebody with knowledge these two questions. And if I can ask you all to just set aside 15 minutes and send that to me and to Carrie by the end of this week. It takes, as you might imagine, takes some time to recruit panelists and to coordinate schedules. And we want to get on that so that we have some productive conversations. And I'm sorry, I think somebody's hand went up and then it went back down. Karen, was that you that had your hand up?
It was me because I was deciding if I should just email you. I'll just say real quickly in terms of panelists, just making sure too we have a statewide perspective. I mean, we already talked about some of our rural communities and how hard it is to access. So in terms of, are there any housing authorities or developers in rural communities that are doing this well or that have these challenges and could speak to that? I think would be helpful if we're looking at statewide recommendations.
I appreciate that reminder, and we will definitely keep that front of mind as we put these together. With that, that's really the bulk of the conversation for today. In a few minutes, I'll talk about next steps. I do want to go to public comment, and right now, the only person that we have who has reached out is Tim Dolan. So Tim, invite you to come on camera if you're in a place to do so. If not, I won't require it. There you are. Welcome to the subcommittee, and invite you to introduce yourself and offer any comments to the group.
Thanks very much. My name is Tim Dolan, and I know a few of you on the call here, so hello. And just by way of background, I was at CHAFA for 18 years and then at the State of Colorado Division of Housing for a short time thereafter. And now I run an organization called the Inclusive Housing Coalition, which is a Colorado nonprofit, which is has a mission to increase housing for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, affordable housing for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So our space, in terms of relevant to your committee, really has to do with cognitive accessibility. So I would like to take the opportunity here, and thank you for the opportunity, to just offer a couple of thoughts as you move forward through your work. The first has to do with I would urge you to consider services as you go through your analysis and you go through your work, and the reason for that is that in a lot of ways you really can't, much like with permanent supportive housing, when it comes to housing for folks with IDD, it's really it's not wise to separate services from the housing. And I know that, you know, the thought might be, well, services, that's a whole different thing. We're talking housing here. It's really important to keep them together, much with permanent supportive housing. If you take the service provision out of permanent supportive housing, the whole model doesn't really work. And that's really the case with IDD housing as well. And I'll give you an example. You guys talked a lot about plain language and you talked a lot about contracts and those kinds of things. Well, one of the best ways to sort of help folks with IDD, particularly if they have a executive function deficit with these types of plain language contracts and so on and so forth, is to have an advocate to help work them through that. And it really goes, you know, as you guys mentioned, it really goes far beyond just the lease agreements and those kinds of things. If it's an affordable housing property, there's a need to go through an income certification process every year. And that's not something you want to get wrong. It could jeopardize your living situation. So with regard to just that specific thing you talked about, I just wanted to give you an example. Having service provision to help somebody through that in an affordable housing property is really important. Going along with the same thread of services, I would really also urge you guys to consider looking at the Medicaid home and community service-based waivers situations that are going on. It could really be its own task force. So, you know, it's really a situation that really could utilize its own task force. But as you make recommendations, it's really important that you keep an eye on the fact that the Medicaid service provisions or reimbursements as they exist now are really insufficient to really help people overcome those barriers to be in the housing situation that they want to be in. So along with that, I would also urge you guys as you go through and look at your data to segment what you're looking at into the various settings that people are living in, right? Because it's really not just about apartment living, it's housing living, it's living with parents, it's living in group homes. There's a whole set of different kind of living situations that it's beneficial to look at as you're making recommendations. And then lastly, with regard to things I would urge you to take a look at is I totally hear that there's a lot of need for you guys to have data. There's a lot of data that's out there existing. There are reports that have been done. There are assessments that are going on right now. Brian mentioned the Kelsey being here. The reason that the Kelsey was here was to facilitate a developer roundtable that happened yesterday. And that is all part and parcel of an assessment that's being done by in conjunction with Denver Human Services to come up with plans to how they might be able to use their mill levy. So that's just by way of saying that there's a lot of data out there. Now that's sort of Denver centric. So it's not all encompassing with regard to the state, but it does provide a really good barometer with regard to some of the things that you guys are looking at. In addition to that, there are, I would advocate that the need for data is not just a need for your particular subcommittee here, it's really an ongoing need, right? And that really goes along with the bill that's making its way through the Senate right now, 24-174, I would have you guys take a look at, which calls on local jurisdictions to do a housing assessment periodically, and then housing plans. If you read through the bill, you'll see that does not exist in there is anything that really calls out disabilities. It's really important that and the reason it's important that you have disability information with regard to housing assessments is that if you're going to build housing for folks with IDD, you need to know what the demand is, right? Most affordable housing properties, they rely on housing studies, right? They rely on market studies that are done, but those don't call out folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities in those market studies. So it's really important to have efficacious data that you can rely on when you're applying for the resources that are out there. So thank you very much. My organization stands ready to help with any sort of information we can give, formally, informally, online, offline, whatever it looks like, to connect you with people that you can talk to that will help you as you gather information to make recommendations. Because, hey, no pressure here, but your success is our success. And so we really want you to be successful. Thank you very much. And with that, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys today.
Thank you very much, Tim. And I dropped you a message in the chat. If you'd be willing to shoot either me or Carrie your email address, we would love to follow up with you and take you up on that offer to be a resource. Your last few comments, it's like you heard, or we were reading your mind. Our first few conversations were all about when they say what's the need for accessible housing. That's not such a simple question. What housing, for whom, and where? And we started, trying to filter through the crosstabs of the demographers' data and some of the surveys. It's far from perfect. And while we are prohibited and therefore will not engage in a conversation about a specific piece of legislation, I think you highlight a reason that members of the community may want to be looking at that. And I think we certainly as a subcommittee have the availability of data is something that's been raised by this group throughout our conversations.
Cool. Happy to help when we can.
Wonderful. If you'll shoot one of us your email, I will follow up. With that, I'm just going to wrap us up real quick with some next steps. As I said, the first next step is not mine, it's yours, other than me asking. And my ask is, again, if you all would give some real thought between now and end of day Friday to the types of people or specific people or organizations you would like to hear from, you think this group would benefit from hearing from when you think about our overall charges, and what questions you'd like them to come ready to discuss. If you can shoot me that. In the meantime, Carrie and I are going to be working to start assembling these panels. We'll assemble the notes from today's. Really appreciate the conversation around things like contract accessibility. If you have additional thoughts there, shoot them over to us. But we'll put together some summary notes. We'll start prepping these panels, and we'll let you know as those come together for next month. Other than that, we've got 5 minutes, so if anybody has any final closing thoughts, I welcome them. Otherwise, I'm also always happy, particularly at the end of your day, to give a little time back. Is there anything anybody wants to say before we jump off? Hearing none, I will do as I always
jump
do.
in.
Jump in, Paul.
Sorry, Paul Brady
No.
again. I'm mostly just looking to focus my efforts. I just hear so much, I don't know. In my mind, when I hear affordable housing or some of that, it's contained within the affordable world, or not affordable, tax credit or deed restricted or defined by that topic. We're still looking to address elements of housing outside that, and speakers that can speak outside that.
100%. We
Okay,
have
cool.
a specific charge to look at making recommendations for financing structures related to affordable housing. But our charges to look at inventory and demand is for all housing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, with that, I will again sincerely thank all of you. I know you have busy days, busy jobs, busy weeks, and you're doing this on top of all of that. So thank you sincerely for the time you give to this subcommittee and this task force. We will follow up with all of you, and we'll look forward to assembling some panels that respond to the ideas you've raised and to seeing you all next month. Thanks all.